We're back on MorningLine. Thanks for joining us as we continue to talk about the aftermath of what happened in Washington, D.C. yesterday and, of course, moving forward. Our next guest this morning, we're glad to have him joining us from Washington, D.C., from his office building there in the Capitol, and that is Representative Jim Cooper, Tennessee representative. Nice to have you with us, Congressman. Thank you. And you are there in the Longworth building where you were yesterday when you did an interview with Phil Williams while all of this was going on. Can you tell us what things are like there and give me your take on where we stand this morning?
Thank you, Nick. It's good to be with you always. Things look like they've returned to normal here in Washington. It's a beautiful, clear day. A lot of the debris from around the Capitol is being cleared up. Most members have left town. I'm about to drive back to Tennessee. Can't wait to get home. But yesterday was one of the saddest days in all of American history because it had been over 200 years since our Capitol was successfully attacked. Then it was by the British, a foreign enemy. Unfortunately, this time it was by our own citizens.
Let me ask you this. I guess you've been on record since this happened yesterday talking about the president and again mentioning the word impeachment. I know we've also heard some indications that maybe the 25th Amendment's being discussed. Tell me where you stand on that and whether or not you think it's realistic that the president could be removed before the inauguration.
Well, Nick, I'm for whatever gets him out of office the fastest. We in Tennessee went through a similar experience with Ray Blanton, a former governor, who was replaced early by Lamar Alexander because people were so worried about what Ray Blanton was doing in office. People should be worried today. It's just not my concern. Every living former Secretary of Defense already wrote a letter, and this letter was actually led by Republicans, conservative Republicans, people like Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, very worried that the president would, as commander-in-chief, call out our military to do the same work that his rioters did yesterday. Now, it's one thing for the president to incite a mob. It's another thing for the president to order the wonderful men and women in uniform to obey unlawful orders. So that's our greatest fear at this point. There are 12 days left. Impeachment would be great. He's already been impeached once. It didn't do that much good. The 25th Amendment, is the cabinet going to take him on? I doubt it. These are all his toadies and sycophants. We really need to make sure that we're on guard the next 2 weeks because it could be a very dangerous period.
Now, you heard perhaps that the president said in his most recent statement that he released that, yeah, he's going to accept, I guess, the transfer of power. I don't know if you take him on his word on that. There was much more to his statement along those lines, but he seemed to indicate he's going to accept the results. Do you buy that? Do you believe it?
Well, his closest staff seems to be resigning. They are terrified of the man that they're seeing in the Oval Office. He seems to have lost his faculties. It's a very dangerous time for our country because he has awesome power and we have to make sure he doesn't abuse it. He has lots of other ways to hurt the nation. He could start a war. He could push the nuclear button. When you're a deranged man like this, we have real concerns. So Congress should be doing everything possible to make sure that we minimize the damage, and the best way to do that would be to remove him from office.
Let me ask you this, if you can. I know that you spoke with Phil Williams, while it was going on. Can you give me a sense of at what point yesterday you were given the all clear? How long were you and your staff there in the office, and at what point, and what was it like when you stepped out for the first time to look around inside there?
Well, Capitol Hill has thousands and thousands of protests, and many that are larger than this one yesterday. But this really got ugly early and turned into a riot and then an insurrection. The Capitol Police seemed largely overwhelmed, if not sometimes complicit with the rioters. It was about a 7-hour lockdown in the office. It was too late to evacuate the Hill. There was no place to go. So we were told to not only shelter in place, but to barricade the doors, to turn off the lights, to remain silent. And that lasted for about 7 hours. Finally, the Senate was able to meet again. All the senators had been quarantined in the same room. House members were scattered in 3 office buildings. So the House resumed about 9 o'clock last night. The Senate had resumed about 8 o'clock last night, and we continued business until 4 o'clock in the morning. That's when I finally got to bed. We didn't get the all clear sign, though, until about 1 o'clock in the morning, hours after the House had resumed session. and you really didn't know if madmen or crazies were still roaming the hallways. Pipe bombs were left in front of the Democratic and Republican national committees. Fortunately, the protesters don't seem to have expected to have entered the buildings as successfully as they did. Otherwise, they would have wreaked a lot more damage.
There were some images that came across on TV that I saw where there were protesters, rioters, once they made it in, that appeared to be holding zip ties. Have you heard anything along the lines that part of their intentions perhaps were to take hostages or to hold some of the congressmen and women?
Well, I'm watching the pictures myself, and a lot of the perpetrators should be brought before our justice system. It was outrageous. It was a guy who looked like Chewbacca in a bikini who just sat in the chair of the U.S. Senate. People literally climbing the walls, not only outside the Capitol, but inside the Senate chamber. As I say, this hasn't happened in over 200 years. Something went terribly wrong yesterday. And I'm worried that the president's role in inciting the violence was a key part of that.
And what questions will you and others have perhaps today? And you mentioned it a moment ago about, you had the Capitol Police, but it just seemed like they were woefully ill prepared for what this crowd, which we saw gathering, right, for several, at least the day before, and we saw it coming. And when you think back to the BLM protest last year and the show of force that was there on the Capitol steps compared to what we saw yesterday, really a stark contrast. Do you have concerns about, the preparations and why they weren't better prepared?
I don't have an answer to that now. There were at least 10 days of warning, and the crowd started forming a day or two ago. The barricades were up, but we're seeing pictures of police allowing the protesters through the barricades. In some cases, it seems like almost inviting them into the Capitol. So I hope those pictures are misleading. I hope that's not true, but something went terribly wrong.
Do you have any other knowledge? Have you learned anything else this morning? I'm not sure what you've heard as you've walked around and you've returned to your office. We now know that 4 people died. There was 1 woman who was shot, and the circumstances, I guess, still being investigated. And then 3 others that maybe died from health-related causes. Of course, tragic in all 4 cases. And any more thoughts along those lines and the injuries? And I guess it could have been worse.
Well, in a sense, we may be lucky that we saw that they could have done more damage, but they were unprepared themselves, these insurrectionists. But we should take that as a warning and never let it happen again. Now, tourists and visitors are always welcome on Capitol Hill, but it's got to be peaceful. It's got to be the tradition of American peaceful protest. It cannot be violent, especially on Capitol Hill. I've been telling people this, even criminals know that you don't vandalize a church. And the U.S. Capitol is kind of like everybody's church or synagogue or mosque. You don't mess with that building. It's one of the greatest symbols of hope and freedom for the planet. America is the greatest country on earth. And in order to stay that way, we have to respect our own form of government. Because this was sedition. This was insurrection. This was a form of fascism. This is wrong. This should not happen in America.
And as we wrap things up, Congressman, years ago I worked on a congressional staff there, and I remember the security then that I thought was kind of heavy. Then I went back after September 11th and the change that really came and how secure D.C. is. And now, after this, I'm trying to imagine what security is going to be like for everyone, certainly at least for the next 2 weeks. Can you give me a sense of how much different it might be starting today compared to what it was maybe last week, and what more they'll be doing security-wise?
Well, we take an oath of office to protect and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. Our founders put that last word in there for a good reason, because sometimes the enemies of democracy and the Constitution are born in America. Unfortunately, they've been fed lies for so long, they have trouble distinguishing the truth from falsehood. We all need to resist that poisoning, that propaganda that people are swallowing whole and not even bothering to fact check it. Some of the lies that we get calls in on or emails at our office are so transparent, you can't believe that any adult would believe this stuff. But it's a little bit like, Nashville school children. Virtually every one of them has heard about alligators that live in the New York City sewers. One child at Nashville's even written a song about it. To my knowledge, that's never been true, but yet Nashville school children still believe that about a city that they may have never visited. And I don't think alligators can live that far north. I'm not sure. I haven't checked the sewer system. But that's a good example of how, at an innocent level, a lie can get halfway around the world before truth can get its boots on. And we've got to make sure that we all focus on the truth.
Yeah. Well said. And I see a lot of those very comments right now as folks are following us on Facebook. Some folks still, kind of believing the lies and then calling you a liar. And, it's easy enough to confirm. Congressman Cooper, thank you so much for joining us this morning. I'm glad you and your staff are safe. And please have a safe trip back to Tennessee, and we'll talk again. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
All right. That's Congressman Jim Cooper joining us from his office there in the Longworth building in Washington, D.C. He'll be heading back here along with a lot of the other congressmen will be leaving as well town this week, at least into the weekend. But he was in the middle of it all yesterday when there was a lockdown. And as he said, more than 7 hours, they had to barricade the doors. Can you imagine that? Listen, we'll take a break. When we come back, we'll be joined by constitutional attorney, well-known local attorney, David Rabin, to talk on some of these issues and others as well right after this. Stay with us.